One. Okay, so hey everybody, today we're getting started with lecture, which is focused on can we consume our way out of environmental problems? So some updates before we get going. So all grades for weekly responses and the midterms will be caught up for the most part by Sunday, as we're working on it. But just to let you know that grades for lecture and section won't be graded until the end of class. And when I say midterms, uh, I let me backpedal a bit on that. Midterms will be graded by the following Sunday. So weekly responses will be all cut up by this Sunday, and then the midterm will be done by the following Sunday. If you have any questions, just let me know. Okay. Our weekly response for this week will be posted on GouchoSpace right after class. But basically, I want you to consider your own consumption, which is the topic for today's lecture, but also related to what's coming up for the rest of the week. So I want you to consider your own consumption. So what material, objects, and food are you buying? I want you to consider that for the past week. So what informed your decisions to buy and eat what you did? Did any of them involve environmental considerations? For example, do you like to buy organic? Have do you have any health concerns that mean that you can only buy in a certain way? You can only buy a certain kind of food, or maybe you're allergic to a specific kind of material. You know, any of those things count as environmental considerations, whether, you only do recyclable things, maybe you only buy clothes at thrift stores. Get into some of that for me. Oop, went ahead. Nope, what is going on? Come, what? No. So did any of them involve environmental considerations? Why or why not? And then finally, if money were no object, what consumer decisions would you make? So besides having a house, stability, and other essentials. In particular, I want you to consider, like if you did have as much money as you wanted, what kinds of financial decisions would you be making? Would you always be shopping organic, or would you just run your own farm so you always knew where your food was coming from? Would you take sewing classes so that you could make your own clothes? These I'm interested more in that, not just like buying like 10 yachts, which, while fun, is kind of the opposite of what we're going to be talking about this week as far as consumption is concerned. So our attendance question for today is, what was the last thing you bought? So in the chat, just write, what was the last thing you bought? Be aware that other people are going to be reading this. So, within reason. If you have to fudge it a bit, maybe it was like something that you bought like before you bought the last thing you bought, that's fine. Groceries, ice cream, a ring. Ooh, Yenny, that's fun. Cup of noodles. Yep. Gas. Yeah, that happens. Eyebrow dye. Ooh, Hunter, what book? Coffee, a pair of jeans, two pairs of heels. Ooh, fancy. Groceries, coffee, food, Coke, bagel, a Mandalorian sweatshirt from a small business on Etsy. Oh, that's fun. More rings, but from a thrift store. A yerba, very nice. Mini pancakes with ice cream. That sounds decadent and wonderful. Red hair dye. I am there. I'm not there with you, but I have been there with you. I used to dye my hair red all the time. Ooh, Hitchhiker's Guide. That is actually one of my favorite books. One of my most favorite books. I'm very happy for you. nail stuff because you do your own nails, and that sounds great. I'm very jealous. I do not have those skills. The best I can do is paint them and hope for the best. I think for me, I bought picture frames. I have a problem, especially I go to a Ross Dress for Less and I buy cute picture frames, and then I put art in it. Like sometimes, but art is very loose. It could be like collages that I make, or postcards, or art from my friends, or photos. It's just a mess. Um, it is not very environmentally sustainable, but it's one of the things that got me through quarantine, if I'm being honest. Um, and Ashley, you got a McDonald's McGriddle. I hear that. McGriddles are very good. Um, yeah. Okay. So keep this in mind as you write your weekly response for this week. If you were unsure of what you bought, maybe just have a note in your phone to, just when you buy something, just, keep track of it. Um, yeah. And this isn't to shame or, make you feel bad if you're just buying like a whole bunch of comic books or something. Like, honestly, that was what I spent most of my money on as an undergrad. It, it was bad. Like, there is no tea, no shade in whatever you are buying, but I want you to just kind of keep track of it, and I want you to think about what is making the decisions for you. So we a lot of times we think that we are the ones who are deciding what we buy. However, some of the things that we are really going to get into starting today has to do with the fact that there are many other larger factors, especially environmental ones, that encourage us to buy in certain directions, or make or just realities that make it impossible to buy what and how we want to buy. Awesome. So today's pets we have Ruby, Rosie, Chewy, and Lola. They are all cute. I love the looks on, frankly, all of these animals' faces. I love that Chewy, from my perspective, looks like he's about to get up to mischief. Rosie is just kind of watching to see what happens. Ruby, like, can't tell if she's just here to party or if she's just here for a cuddle. I know none of these pets, but they look very cute. And then Lola, our sleeping little angel right here. So thank you so much for sharing your pets. We are actually out of pets in the pet forum, so please feel free to add any of your companions. They don't have to be dogs and cats. We've already featured a bird. That's a bird is a very obviously a pet, but like anything. I've featured plants before in past classes. Also, a very serious pet rock collection that wasn't just a rock and it was like, here, Nikki. So please, please, please post them. Um, yeah. And then, okay, in the chat, Araceli says, I don't have a pet. Please, someone else send pics. Um, oh my God, is Chewy? Oh my God, Chewy got bit by a rattlesnake after 5 minutes after that. Yeah, so I was right. He was up to mischief, but it cost you like $1,600. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. That's super scary. Yeah, so please send pictures. I have one picture that I can send of my cat Mew Mew, who is mostly an outside cat, but like then that's it. Then our pets for lecture after that, if nobody else puts in pet pictures, is just going to be pictures of my bookshelves. And while I think that's fun, they're far less cute. So make sure to put some pictures in. We would love to see and enjoy your pets, especially for those of us who maybe don't have any. So last lecture, we were talking about conservation. We were talking also about preservation. And so conserving nature just in general is essential for addressing climate change. And addressing climate change is also essential for conserving nature. So we need to make sure that we're using natural resources to the best of our ability, making sure that we are using them in a way that doesn't get rid of all of the benefits that natural resources provide to the environment, like ecosystemic services. But there's also the part of preservation where we want to make sure that we're preserving a sense of nature for people to experience either, recreationally, spiritually, emotionally, especially culturally. Um, that is just as important in some ways, and for some folks, even more important for addressing just radical inequalities in the US and all over the world. But as far as climate change and thinking through the problems that we have just as people on planet Earth in 2021, nature-based climate change solutions, so conserving and restoring ecosystems, are essential. So we talked about a lot about conservation achievements. We also talked about preservation achievements with different policies really starting at the beginning of the 20th century. But conservation and preservation as practice has been integral to human survival. Like I said, there is really a difference between conservation and preservation. Conservation is much older. Preservation comes from a more recent tradition of wanting to be able to access pieces of the past, whether they be only cultural artifacts or places that are, outside in their cultural landscapes. But for all of this work, values come into play, which we talked about last week. And values come into play when we're trying to understand how an area will be conserved and how they're related to our attitudes, norms, beliefs, and behaviors. Remember, there are anthropocentric and non-anthropocentric values. And I don't think we got to watching the video about the gray wolf, but if you are interested, I can post that for you on GachoSpace. So there are three major ways that humans value the environment. There's the consideration of cost-benefit analysis. So if we have to hope that the benefits of doing something will outweigh and be larger than our costs. When we're considering a conservation or preservation project, when we're considering different technological solutions, which we'll get through to later in the quarter, will the benefit of making an electric car end up benefiting the environment more than how much it will cost to both the consumer and the environment. We want to make sure that when we're making things, especially to make some sort of dent in climate change and work towards addressing environmental inequity and injustice, we want to make sure that we're doing more good than harm. So there are problems that come with this, like how do we calculate costs and benefits? So what gets included, what gets excluded? How do we assign dollar values to things we don't normally think about in those terms? And another thing that comes from it is, once we do this analysis, how do we project these values for maximizing social welfare and minimizing the cost to benefit ratio by the future? So, and there's lots of ways that we try to do this. There's a discount rate. So the value of the future compared to the present is going to be different. Um, we don't know what the future holds. We don't know how things will be valued in the future. So for example, if we're trying, this is this is a pie in the sky. This is a random and, at least from our perspective now, pretty impossible example, but say, we are trying to conserve water in California. We are in drought. And so the benefit to conserving water and thinking ahead is ginormous. We need this in order to continue to have a California that has some sort of resemblance to the California of today. However, there are things that we can't know, that we don't know. So for this is like a science fiction example, but say we figure out a way to I mean, like some of the examples that I'm coming up with, like change change non change how to say, like, basically how to change toilet water back into drinkable water, which is actually something that we know how to do. So that doesn't count. But say, water, we found a well that we had no idea about. Again, this is a very pie in the sky science fiction example, but we would have a miscalculation on that part of knowing and being able to assess the benefit to the cost. There's also things to consider like efficiency and equity. So when we say total balance, total benefits, who's actually included in those benefits? Who is part of the whole? How are they distributed? How fast are we accessing these different benefits? There's also intergenerational justice. So considering not screwing over future generations to benefit us in the present. This, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, were, I mean, throughout most of human history, but especially after industrialization to probably the 1970s, as we'll kind of get to today, the there was less concern about the future. There was more concern about the present and making it as comfortable and efficient as possible. Um, it isn't to say that everyone felt that way, but as a culture, as a global Western culture, that was the kind of biggest and most important aspect. Other things, this is kind of part of the discount rate, but uncertainty. Don't know everything. We don't know everything about anything. We don't know everything about the past. We certainly don't know everything about the present. And we know basically nothing about the future. We can make projections, but we don't know how accurate they'll be. There's also problems with irreversibility. So there are a lot of actions, especially considering the um, environmental sciences, that can't be undone. You can certainly plant a tree again, right? Like if you cut it down, you can plant a seed and hope that a tree will grow, but it won't be the same tree. It won't have the same information or same experiences. There are some things, especially when considering the environment, that just can't be undone. Um, and then, because of all of these things, there's a precautionary principle that holds that we should avoid risk when consequences are high. And the consequences seem even higher when we're thinking about the future, and also when we're thinking about things from a global perspective, as climate change forces us to. So the other two values are ecosystem services and natural capital, as these are things that the environment can provide us. So these reflect the actual values people receive from nature far better than, other traditional economic approaches that, as you can hopefully see at least a bit in the last slide, devalue crucial services for which no clear markets exist. So there are these things are very difficult to measure. It's also difficult to monetize because they have been so devalued. And when I say devalued, I mean taken for granted for so long. And it's also difficult to figure out who should pay and how much for what. And there's tons of different natural resources that we take for granted. I think the biggest one is water. But we also take advantage or take for granted access to buildable sources. So 19th and early 20th century was definitely wood, but also coal and different minerals to make metals. We just kind of used and used and used and consumed and consumed and consumed. To the point where we have to be very explicit in how we think about ecosystem services and natural capital. But with that, because some of these resources and are part of bigger ecosystem services, some of these things are just necessary for human survival. We need water. We also need places to live. Consider Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So it gets tricky when we're considering buying things that we just need on this land. Like we buying products that we require to exist. So with this, there have been many attempts to try to navigate this. One of the most recent ones was the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So this was adopted by all members of the United Nations in 2015 to provide a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. So the United Nations began focusing on environmental degradation policy really in the 1990s with their 21st Agenda, which came out of the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. But while that kickstarted a conversation, it ended up being more focused on in how environmental degradation was impacting animals and especially endangered species, also some humans, and let's not forget that. But the focus was more on non-human flora and fauna than actually considering the bigger, what we now in 2021 would consider environmental justice issues. So with 2015, it really kickstarted a lot of international and transnational policies. So nations working together where the environment was concerned, with the most influential, of course, being the Paris Agreement on climate change. And we'll be talking about that in coming weeks. But these developments are truly where some change can happen, because especially when you're dealing with such a big issue as global climate change, you really need to have most, if not all, of the globe on board to address it. And certainly the participants who are creating the most problems regarding climate change should be even more involved and more responsible, which at least in the US context, but in other, especially European places, has not been so easy, which again, we will talk about in coming weeks. So a little background information. Worldwide material consumption expanded so rapidly, especially after the end of World War II. So this was called the Great Acceleration in 1945. Um, and an example that really illustrates where this has gone now is that in 2017, worldwide material consumption reached 92.1 billion with a B tons, and extraction is rapidly trying to keep up with demand, which when you are trying to replace natural resources, in particular, I mean, I am most familiar with trees, but there's also mining, there's also gas. Some of these things can't can't be so easily replaced. Gas making gas, or you know, just making getting oil out of the ground or the ocean, that material that's required to make oil, and we'll talk about this in the next week or so, that takes a lot of labor and a lot of energy, which is already a problem, but also that isn't easily replaced either. That material takes millions and millions of years to make. So there's lots of considerations here. Environmental consumption is just very, very messy. So the targets of this 2015 work was to work towards a sustainable consumption and achieve sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources, so that by 2030, half per capita food waste, they wanted to cut in half per capita food waste globally. They wanted environmentally sound management of all chemical and wastes. They wanted to reduce waste by reduce, reuse, recycle, which is very old school, very, at least from my perspective, late 80s, early 90s practice, but they wanted to really hold onto that policy. They also wanted to help, quote unquote, developing countries with science and technology to make these goals and be global citizens. That this part in particular is pretty problematic. You know, first and foremost, what and where is a developing country? This phrase is usually used as code for basically the global South. Also, what does it mean to be a global, what do you have to do to become a global citizen? Why, not just by being on the globe, why would you not just already naturally be included because you're on the planet? But this is some of the work that they were considering. They also wanted to restructure companies, especially through taxation, and this was mostly aimed at the US, phase out subsidies that adversely impact the environment. So, especially after 1945, during the the process of making necessary products to feed the war effort really drastically reshaped industry during the 1930s and 40s throughout the US and Europe especially. When the war ended, they were left with all of this industrial infrastructure, and it was very unclear what could be done. For example, we were making lots of corn. Corn could, you know, besides eating it, which is fine and good, it could also make oil. It could also, and then just as a raw material, it could be, and as an oil, it could be used to make other products that were being used on the front lines. So we had all of this infrastructure for industrial corn, but then all of the sudden there was a vacuum of need for it because, you know, we stopped being at war. So there are lots of political and economic considerations when thinking about the value, obviously the value of natural resources, but with that also comes a lot of cultural and historical baggage, because again, it is really hard to undo something that is already in motion, especially when there's lots of money tied to it, as there are with subsidies. If you're interested in learning more about that, in a past iteration of this class, I had students read more and watch more about Michael Pollan. He talks about industrial natural resource management. It's very interesting. It's especially oriented around food. So if you have any interest, just hit me up. And the problem, so with all of these different targets, I've kind of illustrated some of the issues with these things. Like how do we half food waste? How do we reduce, reuse, recycle? And so how do we do all of these things? But also, especially when considering the last question with restructuring company taxation and phasing out subsidies, we also have to ask why. Meaning, why did we get here in the first place, and how? And then the how is, how do we make sure that we don't go back to that and it's just restructured around subsidies for other eventually extractive industries? So again, how will this all get done and who ends up paying for it? Which leads to the question, because water is so important, especially in California, how much would you be willing to pay for clean water? How much would you be willing to pay for air? How much, if 2020 and 2021 with its timber shortage, was wood was marked up to be, I want to say the last figure I saw was 500 or 600% more than usual. How much would you be willing to pay for building supplies to make a home? I know uh, I'm kind of saying something a little outlandish, because I know, at least for me and probably a fair amount of you, buying a home seems pretty much out of the question, but these are still considerations. We have basic human needs that are literally built from environmental natural resources, and people charge money for them. And the price comes from a lot of places, but it changes how we're able to engage with not only the environment and natural resource products, but also ourselves. If you don't have enough money for clean water, or if you don't have access to clean water, like Flint, Michigan, still, you're going to have to pay even more to get what you need. That, for most of human civilization, was just a very shared common with no tragedy, just it was a shared common. You need wood to build a house? Just take the wood, just cut down the tree. You want a drink of water? Look for some clear water. It's probably fine, which isn't to romanticize things, especially before capitalism. Like, for example, I was born partially deaf. I needed a surgery for that, and my eyesight is terrible. I would not make life before, honestly, before the late 20th century. I would probably have died pretty quick. But all of this is to say that, I'm not romanticizing this, but I want you to consider how large consumption plays in the work that we do as people interested in learning about, working with, and working to protect the environment. Uh, and also just how it shapes our daily experience, like just even like not putting the environment at front and center. How is all of this changing who we're able to be and why? So this idea of a willingness to pay really brings us to today's question. Can we consume our way out of global environmental crises? And as kind of a callback, this was actually the original intention of national and state parks. There was this idea to see America first, that if you had folks see the beauty of their country, especially as global travel rose in the mid 19th century, there was a belief that middle and upper class people, instead of traveling to see all of the wonders of Europe, instead they should see all the wonders of their country, because if they saw it, not only would they be spending money there, but they would also probably donate to expand those different services. So they were trying to push, especially conservationists tied with park building like John Muir. In my research, Save the Redwoods League, these folks were trying to push people to visit because they believed that if they were to see the nature, they would want to save the nature. And to save the nature, that meant helping uh, usually organized groups of people working with local, state, and federal services to buy the nature from corporations and industrialists to try to make parks. Another example of this is with the early Save the Redwoods League. This is from 1920. This was one of their first projects, which was creating a path to actually get to groves of redwoods. So this is in Crescent City, which is about 20 miles south of the Oregon border. It is very pretty. It has been transformed into US 101. It's a very long road that stretches much more south if you've ever been up there. But, in order to get people to see America, to save America, they needed to build and move around nature to get them there. And, so with creating national and state parks, eventually you have to create an industry in order to support them. This graphic was supposed to be cleaner. I'm sorry. I can put it in our gacho space, but basically this breaks down some of the numbers surrounding they surrounding national park services, like how much they bring in, how many people they bring in, how they bring it. It's a really cool graphic. I wish that I could show it to you. I'll share it later, but this is to illustrate that national parks, well, I love them. They're one of my most favorite things. um I mean, basically ever, besides having a long history of displacing and dispossessing indigenous folks and, quote unquote squatters, they are also still a business at the end of the day, while again a really cool one, and has done a lot of work within the federal government to fight for the environment. They're still a business, and businesses are still extractive industries. And so I just kind of want to have you consider, especially when we're talking about consumption, that there are so many things that seem just a overall net positive when we consider the benefit, their benefit, like parks. Parks are usually one of people's favorite parts of the U.S. government. They get a lot more love, for example, than say uh, like the IRS or DMV estate, but they get a lot more. National Park Service gets a lot more love than more kind of bureaucratic facing, just more inside office jobs. But they're still a business. So we can see that with how many visitors that they have. So this is from the eclipse that we had in 2017. You need a lot of infrastructure. You need different museums. You need pathways. You need funky, fun eclipse glasses. You need a whole bunch of stuff to get people into a park safely and not hurt themselves. you of course also need a gift shop, which again is another example of, you know, being an industry. They're literally selling things. I know I'm very guilty of buying magnets and also books and also sometimes t-shirts and also pin, like I have a problem is what I'm saying. But this is part of the industry model. And then if you're outdoorsy, you know that there is a lot of gear that you need to get out there too. I strongly believe nature is for everyone. I strongly believe in, you know, people engaging with nature. And again, very grateful that we have national and state parks or any, you know, area, any public lands. But it costs a lot of money and you need a lot of things to do something that for the longest time, for most of human history, was free. So this leads to what Edward Abbey talked about in his polemic on industrial national parks. So he says industrial tourism is a threat to the national parks, but the chief victims of the system are the motorized tourists. They are being robbed and robbing themselves. So long as they're unwilling to crawl out of their cars, they will not discover the treasures of national parks and will never escape the stress and turmoil of the urban suburban complexes, which they had hoped, presumably, to leave behind for a while. So, in a lot of ways, I mean, even in this image with lots of different kinds of comfort, I can see just by some of these brands that they are very expensive. Um, we can see here packaged food. All of these things, from Abby's perspective, is taking people away from actually connecting with the land. This is an older argument tied to the back to the land movements of the 1890s. There was also a upsurgence of it in the 1960s. But and you know, and that has its own kinds of issues. This has its own kinds of problems that come with just consumption in general and people not potentially wanting to see or interact with nature in the same ways as other people. But it also means that even our most natural seeming spaces, our most wild seeming spaces, maybe aren't as wild as we think. So, so Edward Abbey said that in 1968. He later came up with the term and wrote about a fictionalized version of doing something called monkey wrenching, which is to get rid of capitalist impediments stopping nature. We can talk about that later too. I'm gonna see how else I can fit that in. Edward Abbey is great. This is from Desert Solitaire, Monkey Wrench Gang, while having some kind of shitty, sorry, kind of bad gender politics. Generally pretty good about fighting the man and fighting against industrialization and national parks or just public lands. But there are still problems. His calling out the problems of an almost kind of Disneyfication of nature is really what almost all of his works get at, is the the crap that we put on uh nature to make it more tenable, to make, in some ways, make it more safe, and that's great, but also to make it a different version of what we romanticize it to be. So he said that in 1968. We then have the explosion of environmentalism following Silent Spring. And the late 1960s, consumers really started to consider what else they could do to help the environment. So this came to the forefront of people's minds in the late 1980s as endangered species were on the rise. We talked about reduce, reuse, recycle, so we didn't have to cut down the Amazon rainforest where all of the cute animals were, but also it wasn't really clear how reduce, reuse, recycle did that, but it made us feel good, and so that was fine. It wasn't, but it was what it was. Environmental groups work to hold companies and governments accountable. So we see this reflected in pop culture. We see this reflected in actions made by groups like Greenpeace, but also the Earth Liberation Front. We see PETA and ASPCA trying to call out all of the environmental issues. And because of how where media, especially the news, was by the 1980s, really news media really came to the fore during the Vietnam War, with lots of attention being paid to visual actual news that made things even more of a spectacle. And what could be more of a spectacle besides war and seeing war on the TV than the destruction of nature, especially beautiful places? So this was paired with changing socioeconomic policy in the 90s, especially in the global West. And so this really made consumers consider their own contributions to environmental issues. And this is something that hasn't changed. So can we consume our way out of a global crisis? So here's an example. We have different answers for this, but in 2014, millennials found that our survey of millennials, found that 30% perceived products as more sustainable if they feature green colored packaging. 48 are swayed by nature imagery, and few could explain the meanings of labeling terms like natural, organic, or free range. Being an elder millennial, I feel called out. Also, because the survey is 7 years old, I would say that things have changed, but 7 years isn't that long of a time ago. At least I really hope not, because that would make me feel old otherwise. So while consumers are considering how they can maybe contribute more to changing environmental issues, it's also unclear how to do that work, which has led to consumers finding other ways to take a hint and make sure that they're trying to consume more ethically, or at least in a way that's more aligned with their values or the values that they want to have. So an example of this is greenwashing, which is advertising that are at least seemingly sustainable, and also fighting for what's called a green future, however, while still extracting unsustainably. So here is just a quick example of this with Fiji Water. Let me make sure my volume is up.
Walk into any grocery store and you're bound to see it. Green marketing. It seems to be almost everywhere these days. Our eggs are all natural and our shampoos are encased in green labels adorned with leaves and generic trees. In many respects, this push towards an eco-friendlier consumerism is a positive change. Organic produce and sustainably made clothing are needed if we are to reduce industrial and personal footprints. But unfortunately, hidden among these ethically and environmentally driven products lies an insidious form of advertising: greenwashing. From bath products to meat packaging, greenwashing occurs in almost every sector of the consumer market. But today, let's take a close look at how Fiji Water uses ad campaigns to construct a green image around its otherwise environmentally detrimental company. But first, why exactly is greenwashing bad? Quite simply, it plays into a consumer's desire to live a green life without necessarily creating a sustainable product. And on a deeper level, one of the greenest things to do is to buy fewer things. So no matter how great the product is, it's probably still kind of deceptive to market it as green. So, greenwashing means using titles like all natural or eco friendly, or simply using a green background in order to entice a customer into buying a product that is by no means environmentally friendly. In some cases, bigger companies that falsely label their products as eco friendly, like eggs labeled farm fresh or all natural, can often outcompete smaller companies who are more environmentally grounded and actually employ ethical practices while creating their product. Fiji Water's recent marketing campaign encapsulates the essence of this greenwashing.
Fiji water is a gift from nature to us, to repay our gift of leaving it completely alone, bottled at the source, untouched by man. It's Earth's finest water.
While aesthetically pleasing and pleasant to watch, there are a number of aspects that work hard to shroud Fiji Water's large environmental footprint in a cloud of green. For one, the bright double exposures of nature flickering within the edges of the bottle immediately cue us to Fiji Water's connection to nature. Especially when contrasted with the dark cityscape background, the water bottle appears to be a perfect image of a world quote unquote untouched by man. The visuals are then compounded with the narration of a young girl who anchors the ad with this proclamation.
Bottled at the source, untouched by man.
Clearly, this ad works hard to paint Fiji water as a part of nature, rather than what it really is. Water, bottled in plastics that take many years to degrade, shipped via intensive transportation from Fiji to destinations around the world. Both these practices wreak havoc on the environment, polluting the air and the water. And to bring Fiji's negative impact into sharp relief, 47% of people who live in Fiji don't have access to clean, safe drinking water, according to the World Health Organization. This commercial is just a small part of Fiji's larger campaign that attempts to reimagine the bottled water company as the essence of nature. Spreads like this reveal the larger work at play in Fiji's greenwashed marketing tactics. They are pursuing environmentally minded customers by framing their water bottles as a completely green product. Fiji tells us a one-sided story that appeals to their customers' moral conscience. You can't help but choose Fiji over other bottled waters because they frame purchasing a Fiji bottle as a way to reduce carbon emissions and save the Fijian rainforest, when in fact their product is inextricably tied to the systems of pollution that are causing carbon emissions and deforestation. Greenwashing comes in many forms, and it's not often as clear-cut as with Fiji water. So understanding how and why greenwashing works is essential to spotting it. A critical deconstruction of a cleaning product is necessary if you're buying it solely because it's green. Oftentimes, nature and trees are used to create the impression of an eco-friendly product when there is really no substance to back up those claims. So do some research and shop with intention, because the collective power of consumers can steer companies towards more truthful and ethical products. This
All right. I'm just going to cut it short just for the sake of time. I realized that we are a little behind. That's just me. So, things I'm going to just focus on the things that are going to be really helpful for you to consider as you write your weekly response for this week. So, you should know about the Organic Food Production Act of 1990. So, this held that there were no synthetics to be used, no GMOs, no sewage, no radiation, no antibiotics or growth hormones in any food that was called organic. Further, any food, especially animal, needed access to the outdoors, and crops needed to be rotated. You could not do monoculture. Um, Further, there were regulations on weed and pest control, and also feed for animals. So the bars are the bars are really low here, folks. You would hope that for the most part, these things would be just part of all food, right? You would hope that there wasn't sewage in any food that you bought, or radiation in any food that you bought. However, this act makes at least makes me question what exactly you're buying if you're not buying organic. And that's part of the point. This act gained a lot of attention in the 90s, and organic food in turn became itself an industry because people, similar to 1890 with progressive journalists who were tracing the meat packing industry, for example. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle is the most well known from this time. But again, in 1990, people were reminded to be cautious and to actually think about what they were actually buying. And this act made it clear that people really didn't know, especially after the industrialization of food following 1945, especially following 1945. People weren't even sure what they were putting in their bodies anymore. Because there are so many complex and technical regulations that are debated. So natural label means nothing. The act in 1990 was trying to make organic mean something, because if we just take organic without the policy, it's anything that was living, which is frankly most food that exists, at least that isn't excessively processed. So remember that organic leaves out a lot, including some life cycle impacts. So how are they disposed? How are they packaged? How are they disposed? What kind of shipping happens? What kind of emission happens through the creation, manufacture, and shipping of the product? There's also horrible labor conditions and also other environmental impacts like wildlife habitat, etc. uh, Environmentalism, especially in the 90s, had a large focus on, again, on animals and endangered species and beautiful places, because that was easier to market. Making sure that the Amazon rainforest could continue was and continue to be beautiful didn't necessarily consider all of the people who lived on the Amazon River and relied on the forest to survive, not only for basic needs, but also to, to have a level of comfort. And some of that requires industrialization. How do we navigate that? This is an introduction course, so I don't have clear answers for that for you. But these are things to consider when we're thinking about what we buy. Another example is electric cars. So I am guilty of this. I have a hybrid, but lifestyle analyses of electric cars, this is mostly in Europe, suggest that they produce up to, and that's a misspelling, up to, I'm not even sure what that was supposed to mean. I think four more emissions. No, they were supposed to produce more emissions in the manufacturing process than regular gas-powered cars. Over the entire life cycle of the vehicle, however, they produce only half of the total emissions of a gas-powered vehicle due to their greater energy efficiency. So this is a big improvement, but this is by no means, these are by no means zero emission vehicles. You still burn fossil fuels in the production of the car itself and to create electricity. And electricity is getting cleaner all the time, kind of. And there are batteries that are also nearly impossible to recycle because they're so complicated and have so many different parts to them. The material to make them have high costs to the environment where they have to be extracted. And this includes lithium and cobalt, and only a few mines have access to these elements. And the world average of gas-powered automobiles is 22 miles per gallon, where the average for most electric cars is over 100 miles per gallon. So there is, again, a cost benefit analysis to be done. So generally speaking, without changing behavior, we're not going to get anywhere, certainly not anywhere fast. And that's it. Okay. Sorry that we had to speed through a little bit. I didn't want to have you stay later. I just want to share Natalie's thought in the chat during the Fiji video. It's that it's super ironic that people think Fiji water is actually considered high quality. Fiji actually has a serious water hygiene problem. They have extremely high cases of typhoid because human excrement and poor sewage systems pollute the water they drink. So just another example that you are not always sure of what you're buying, but this week I want you to consider what you're buying. I want you to consider what your consumption habits are and what and how they relate to the environment, and how you're thinking about the choices that you make relate to the environment. If you have any questions, stick around. Otherwise, I will see you tomorrow, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
I like that, Daniel. Drink the poo water. That's great. Ian, what's up?
Do you think like having more labels on like organic food packaging, like the amount of CO2 emitted when picking, apples or something, could help solve this problem? Because the milk company Oatly on their milk products have like, oh, this thing took the climate footprint of 0.31 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. Do you think that could be a potential solution, or would people, just disregard that because it's, more information than they need?
I think that it would benefit some people who know what that means. However, we need to make sure that more people know what that means. Just generally speaking, we need more environmental training in K through 12 education. We need more just more not like public knowledge out there. I think ultimately it would get in the way of a lot of consumers' choices, and ultimately Oatly is out of my price range. So really, it just depends. I think it's a good idea, and I wish more. I think after having more education, after maybe a generation of that happening, more information like that would be essential. But I think by that point, we'll likely have a drastically different economy anyway, and drastically different consumption practices following that, because once you have a broad enough awareness of how products are made, how we get things, and it's boiled down to the level that like an elementary school child can understand it, things are just already going to look different. So I don't know is basically my answer to your question.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And like the only reason why I know, kilograms of CO2 equivalent is because I'm also taking